A billionaire spent millions trying to save his son, until a maid's daughter said 6 words that changed everything. The little girl's arm did not tremble. That was the first thing Alaric Vance noticed. Not the words, not the pointed finger aimed directly at his chest, not the sharp intake of breath from Serafina behind her. It was the stillness of that small arm. Straight, certain, unflinching, as if she had rehearsed this moment with God before she walked into the room. The Vance Mansion's grand sitting room had hosted senators, investors, and surgeons from 3 continents. Crystal chandeliers caught the afternoon light and fractured it into 1,000 directions, the way wealth always does, spreading itself thin across everything without warming anything. A fireplace crackling behind a marble frame. Cream sofas no one really sat in. A room designed to impress people who had long since stopped being impressed. And standing in the center of it, one wearing a red cotton dress and a denim vest that had seen better days, was Elowen Hale, 8 years old, unsmiling. Her dark eyes fixed on one of the most powerful men in the country with a quiet, unshakable authority that made the room feel smaller. Behind her, Serafina Hale froze in her maid's uniform. Black dress, white apron, every inch of her screaming mortification. Her hand lifted slightly, an instinct to pull her daughter back, then stopped. Because Elowen was already speaking again. "Ari, marry my mom," she said, her voice steady as stone, "and I'll heal your son." Across the room, Caspian Vance sat in his wheelchair near the window. Pale. Slight. His eyes, usually distant, usually looking at something no one else could see, moved for the first time in days. He looked at the girl. Alaric Vance blinked once. "Excuse me?" His voice came out the way it always did in boardrooms, clipped, cold, designed to end conversations before they became problems. Elowen didn't move. And she didn't apologize. She didn't look at her mother to gauge whether she was in trouble. She simply waited. And that patience, in a child, in his own home, was more disarming than anything she could have said. The audacity should have made him laugh. The absurdity should have made him dismiss it. The sheer insult of it, a maid's daughter standing in his sitting room, pointing at him like a prophet delivering judgment, should have ended the moment in seconds. Instead, something about her steadiness crawled under his skin and would not leave. Alaric Vance had not built a billion-dollar technology empire by being soft. He had not survived the death of his wife by being sentimental. He had moved through grief the only way he knew. Forward, faster, harder. He had hired the finest pediatric neurologists in Switzerland. He had flown in specialists from Boston, from Tokyo, from clinics so exclusive their names appeared in no public directory. He had converted a guest wing of his own mansion into a medical suite. He had paid, and paid, and paid, because paying was the only language of love he had ever learned. And Caspian had only grown smaller. The diagnoses changed but never resolved. Complicated grief syndrome, psychosomatic convergence disorder, trauma-induced neurological suppression. Words that filled reports without filling the silence in this house. Or words that described what the boy was losing without explaining how to give it back. For 14 months, the world's best minds had failed him. And now, a child in a denim vest was standing in his sitting room offering what they could not. Alaric's jaw tightened. He turned to Serafina, whose face had gone the color of ash. "Mrs. Hale," he said quietly, "collect your daughter." Serafina moved forward immediately. But before she could reach Elowen, Caspian's voice came from the window, small, hoarse from weeks of near silence. "Wait," both adults stopped. Caspian was still looking at Elowen. Something in his expression had shifted. Not hope exactly, but the outline of it. The faint, cautious shape of a door, opening somewhere deep inside him. "I want to hear what she has to say," he whispered. The chandelier light caught a crystal prism and threw a thread of gold across the floor, running, almost deliberately, from where Elowen stood to where Caspian sat. And neither child noticed. But Alaric did. He would think about that moment for a long time afterward. How ordinary it looked. How quietly everything began. He did not know, standing in that sun-gilded room with his pride pulled tight around him like armor, that the answer he had spent 14 months and a fortune searching for had walked through his front door every morning at 7 a.m., in a black uniform and sensible shoes. That it had been in his home all along, not in a briefcase, or not in a medical file, not in any currency his world recognized. That it had a name, that it prayed, that it swept his floors and hummed hymns in the hallway and had raised a daughter bold enough to say out loud what heaven had apparently been trying to tell him in quieter ways for months. Seraphina Hale was a widow who had known devastating loss and chosen against all logic to remain gentle. Her daughter was a child who had learned, from somewhere beyond her years, that healing was not a medical transaction. It was a spiritual one. And Caspian Vance was not sick in his body. He was sick in his soul. Alaric didn't know any of this yet. He only knew that he was standing in his own home, in a room designed to project invincibility, and a little girl had just made him feel like the smallest person in it. He cleared his throat, looked at his son, looked at Elowen. 1 hour, he said finally, the words leaving his mouth before his pride could stop them. Elowen nodded, as if that had always been the plan. And somewhere in the mansion's quiet hallway, just beyond earshot, the God that Alaric Vance had stopped speaking to a long time ago waited, patient as 8-year-old certainty, for the rest of the story to begin. Because some miracles do not announce themselves with fire or thunder. Some of them arrive in cotton dresses, march with pointed fingers and unshakable faith, and change everything without raising their voice. This is how the healing of the Vance house began. Not with medicine, not with money. With a little girl who knew something the billionaire didn't. That the heart God intends to restore, no human institution can permanently destroy. But to understand what Elowen's declaration meant, you first have to understand what Alaric Vance had lost, and how a man who could buy anything on earth had become completely bankrupt in the only place that mattered. Isolde Vance had been the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept fresh flowers in rooms nobody visited, who laughed with her whole body and made strangers feel like old friends within minutes. When she died, a rain-slicked road, a Tuesday evening, on a phone call that split Alaric's life cleanly into before and after. She took the warmth of that house with her. Not gradually, all at once. The way a candle doesn't fade, it simply goes out. Caspian had been 10 years old. He'd watched his father replace grief with granite, and quietly, without anyone noticing, had begun to disappear himself. The doctors called it complicated grief. Alaric called it a problem to be solved. Neither of them called it what it actually was. Guilt. Carried by a child too young to know that guilt this heavy can make a body forget how to live. Alaric gave Elowen 1 hour. She took it, and came back the next day without being invited, which he chose not to contest, because Caspian had slept 4 hours that night. The longest stretch in months. By the end of the first week, 1 hour had become every afternoon. Elowen's first act each visit was always the same. She would walk directly to Caspian's room, pull back every curtain, and open the window a precise 2 inches, regardless of the season. Sunlight is medicine, she told him the first time, matter-of-factly, as though she were sharing something obvious. The free kind. Caspian had squinted against the brightness with the expression of someone who had forgotten light was an option, but he didn't ask her to close it. She read to him from a worn paperback. Stories of people who had faced impossible things and come through them, changed rather than destroyed. See, when she finished a chapter, she would close the book and pray, simply, the way children pray when no one has yet taught them to be self-conscious about it. Head bowed, eyes shut, hands folded. Talking to God the way she might talk to someone seated across the table. Help him feel less alone today, she prayed one afternoon. And help his dad too, even though he doesn't know he needs it yet. Caspian had opened one eye. He's going to fire your mom if he hears you saying stuff like that. He's not going to fire her, Elowen said with complete certainty. God's not done with this house. It was on the 9th day that she said the thing no one else had. They were sitting by the window, late afternoon light spreading gold across the floor, and Caspian had gone quiet in the particular way he did when the guilt came back. A stillness that looked like peace but was actually the opposite. Elowen studied him for a long moment. You think it was your fault, she said. Not a question. Caspian's breath caught. What? Your mom. You think she was rushing to get somewhere because of you, and that's why it happened. The silence that followed was the kind that confirms everything. Caspian's eyes filled slowly, the way a room fills with water, from the bottom up, quietly, until it's too late to stop. She was coming to pick me up, he said, barely above a whisper. Jan, I forgot my inhaler at school and she came back for me and the road was… Stop, Elowen said gently. He stopped. God doesn't punish children by taking their mothers, she said. That's not how he works. What happened was an accident, not a punishment, not your fault. You've been carrying something that was never yours to carry. It was a simple thing to say, the kind of thing someone should have said 14 months ago. But sometimes the truth waits for the right voice, the right moment, the right pair of unguarded eyes, and Caspian Vance, in a sunlit room with curtains finally open, heard it for the first time as something he might be allowed to believe. He wept. Properly, fully, in a way Alaric had never seen him do. And Alaric, standing unseen in the hallway, his shoulder pressed against the wall, heard every word of it. Did not move. Could not. The mansion began, in quiet increments, to remember itself. Serafina started cooking at the family table rather than leaving trays outside Caspian's door. Warm food, humble food. The kind built from scratch rather than ordered from somewhere expensive. A soup that smelled of time and patience. Cornbread that had no business being as good as it was. The dining room, which had sat silent and formal for over a year, filled with the small, recovering sounds of people learning to eat together again. And Caspian began sleeping through the night in the second week. By the third, he was laughing, not loudly, but genuinely, at something Elowen said. The sound moved through the house like something returning from a long way off. Alaric watched all of this from doorways and hallways, from the safe distance of a man who had forgotten how to step into warmth without flinching. He felt something he could not name at first. Then he recognized it. Conviction. On the particular discomfort of realizing that what you built your life to believe was not nearly as solid as you thought. On a Thursday morning, 22 days after Elowen had pointed her finger across that gilded room, Alaric stood at the end of the hallway and watched his son rise from the wheelchair with Elowen steadying his arm, and take 3 steps toward the window. 3 steps. Unassisted. Imperfect. Enormous. Caspian gripped the windowsill and stood in the full light of morning, eye breathing. Alaric's hand found the door frame. His jaw worked silently. He had spent a fortune trying to fix what a child had addressed in 3 weeks with open curtains, honest words, and the kind of prayer that assumes God is actually listening. The healing had begun, and it had nothing to do with medicine. It started with a glass of water. Alaric had come down to the kitchen at 11:30. Not for water, really, but for the same reason sleepless people wander houses in the dark, searching for something they cannot name. He had not expected Serafina to be there, seated at the kitchen island with a cup of tea gone cold and a quiet expression that suggested she had been carrying a weight longer than any one evening. She looked up. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then she rose to leave, and he said, without planning to, "You don't have to go." She stayed. And something in the house shifted again. Oh, the way it kept shifting since these 2 women had entered it. Incrementally, like light crossing a floor. They talked for an hour that first night, about nothing significant. About Caspian's progress, about Elowen's stubbornness, about the strange mercy of small improvements. But beneath the words was something else. The particular understanding that passes between 2 people who have each stood at a grave and then had to figure out how to keep living afterward. Serafina laughed softly at something he said, and Alaric realized he had been trying to make her laugh, and that this was the first time in 14 months he had tried to make anyone anything. It became a quiet pattern. Not every night. But enough nights that Alaric began to recognize the sound of her moving through the kitchen downstairs and found reasons not to stay in his room. They talked about Isolde once, briefly. He told her she had kept fresh flowers in rooms nobody visited. Serafina had gone still in a way that meant something, though he didn't know what yet. She talked about Thaddeus, her late husband, in careful portions. A good man, she said. a doctor who believed that communities deserve the same care as wealthy hospital systems. A man who had built something meaningful from almost nothing, and who had loved it the way you love a thing you bled for. Alaric had listened and felt the guilt of proximity without yet knowing why. He found out on a Wednesday, where he had been reviewing a decade-old acquisition file, the kind of administrative archaeology that happens when a corporation grows large enough to forget what it has consumed. A subsidiary expansion in the Northeast Corridor, property purchases, zoning contracts, and buried in the documentation, a list of displaced entities, businesses, clinics, a neighborhood pharmacy, and one community hospital. Hale Community Hospital, established by Dr. Thaddeus Hale. Alaric read the name twice, and then he sat back in his chair and stared at the ceiling for a long time. The expansion had been efficient, clean on paper, the kind of decision that looks like progress from a boardroom and like devastation from the street. The hospital had lost its facility lease when Vance Technologies purchased the surrounding block. Without the building, without capital to relocate, it had collapsed within 8 months. Even the financial ruin that followed had placed extraordinary strain on the Hale family in the years before Thaddeus suffered his fatal stroke. Serafina had known all of this before she walked through his front door for the first time. He found her in the hallway outside Caspian's room. She saw his face and knew immediately. "How long," he said, "have you known?" She didn't pretend. That, more than anything, undid him. "From the beginning," she said quietly. "I came here looking for answers. I thought if I could understand how decisions like that get made, I could—" She paused. "I don't know what I thought. That understanding it might make it hurt less." "You came for justice," he said. The word came out harder than he intended. "Maybe," she said. "At first. And then?" She looked through the half-open door at Caspian, who was asleep. Actually asleep, breathing deeply, one hand curled open on the pillow. "And then I saw a boy who was disappearing," she said. "And I couldn't leave him." Alaric stepped back from her. The armor was back, all of it, every plate, every bolt. His voice dropped to the temperature of a boardroom. "You have been in my home under false pretenses, allowing me to—" He stopped. "This entire time you were—" "I was cleaning your floors," Serafina said, and her voice, unlike his, did not harden. "And watching your son begin to live again. If I wanted revenge, Alaric, your son wouldn't be smiling." The sentence landed the way true things land, without drama, without needing to be repeated. He walked away. The tension lived in the house after that like a change in weather. Caspian felt it immediately. Children always do. He grew quieter, ate less. The sleep that had come back so painfully, slowly, became fragile again. His eyes returned to that distant place. Ilawan sat beside him that afternoon and took his hand. She didn't do anything wrong," Caspian said. He wasn't entirely sure who he meant. "I know," Ilawan said. Then, after a pause, "You can't heal someone while hiding from the truth." She said it simply, the way she said everything, as though she were merely observing something that had always been obvious and was only being patient with the adults who hadn't seen it yet. That night, the storm arrived without much warning. It came in fast from the north, the kind of storm that rattles windows in their frames and turns the world outside to static. Alaric was in his study, not working, just sitting with the weight of what he now knew. Serafina was in the kitchen. Elowen was already asleep. It was the sound that brought them both to the hallway. A soft, terrible sound. The kind a body makes when it gives out quietly rather than loudly. Caspian had collapsed beside his bed. The ambulance arrived within 7 minutes. Its lights swept blue and red across the mansion's pale windows, painting the walls in something that looked almost like warning. Alaric rode in the back, his son's hand in his, and felt the particular helplessness of a man who had spent his entire life building walls between himself and this exact feeling. They had held. Until now. This time, money could not follow him into the storm. The hospital chapel was small and unhurried, more the way sacred spaces often are, as though they exist slightly outside of regular time. A handful of wooden pews, a low light that came from nowhere specific and everywhere at once. a simple cross on the wall that asked nothing of the people who looked at it, only waited. Alaric Vance sat in the back pew at 2 in the morning and did not know how to begin. He had not spoken to God since Isolde's funeral, and even then it had been the kind of speaking that is really just accusation dressed in formal clothes. He had walked out of that church having decided quietly and completely that faith was a comfort for people who could not afford better options. He had better options. He had always found better options. Caspian was 3 floors above him, connected to machines that beeped in the patient, in different rhythm of technology doing what it could. And the doctors had used careful language, stabilizing, monitoring, cautiously optimistic, the kind of language designed to keep a parent from falling apart in the corridor. Alaric had held himself together through the admittance paperwork, through the consultations, through all of it. He was very good at holding himself together. He had been doing it for 14 months. He came apart in the chapel, not loudly. Men like Alaric Vance do not come apart loudly. It was quieter than that. A slow, structural thing, like a building that has been compromised for years finally acknowledging what the foundation already knew. He leaned forward, put his face in his hands, and for the first time in longer than he could measure, stopped performing strength for an audience that wasn't there. "I don't know how to do this," he said to the empty room, to the cross, to whatever was listening. "I built things. That's what I know. I built companies and systems and walls, and I told myself that was enough. That providing was the same as loving. That protection was the same as presence." He stopped, breathed. "It wasn't. I know that now. I knew it before, if I'm being honest. And I chose not to." He was quiet for a moment. The building settled around him, a sound like patience. "I don't want control anymore," he said, and the saying of it cost him something real. "I just want my son to live. Well, not because I built him a future worth inheriting, because he is my son and I love him, and I have been so afraid of losing him that I never let myself be close enough to keep him." He did not bargain. He did not offer anything in exchange. He had spent his entire life in transactions, and he understood, in that dim and honest chapel, that what he was reaching toward was not a transaction. It was surrender. The kind that doesn't feel like losing. The kind that feels, strangely, like being found. "Have mercy on him," he whispered. "Please. Not because I deserve it. Just because he does." 3 floors up, Elowen Hale was sitting in a chair pulled close to Caspian's bed, her small feet not quite reaching the floor. She was not crying. She held his hand and spoke in a low, steady voice. Passages of scripture she had memorized, not as homework, but as sustenance. The way you memorize the things that have kept you alive. "Even when I walk through the darkest valley," she said softly, I will not be afraid, for you are close beside me." She paused, looked at Caspian's face, pale against the pillow. "You're not alone anymore," she told him. "You were never alone. You just forgot for a while." Whether it was the words, or the hand holding his, or something that moved through that room from a source neither of them could see. Caspian's eyes opened. Slowly. Then with increasing steadiness, the way someone surfaces from deep water. He looked at Elowen first, then at the ceiling, then around the room with the clear, quiet eyes of someone returning from a place they do not intend to visit again. "Hey," Elowen said. "Hey," he said back. His voice was rough and small and entirely his. He asked for his father. They told him Alaric was in the chapel downstairs. Caspian was quiet for a moment. Then he reached for the bed rail, and the nurse moved to stop him, and Elowen said simply, "Let him." He walked slowly, and the nurse stayed close and Elowen stayed closer. Down the corridor, into the elevator, through the pale hospital hallway that smelled of antiseptic and fluorescent light. He was weak. His steps were careful and deliberate and utterly determined. He pushed open the chapel door. Alaric heard it and lifted his head from his hands. When he saw his son standing in the doorway, standing, upright, but present, something moved across his face that had no adequate name in any language he had ever learned to speak. Caspian walked to him slowly and sat down beside him in the pew. "Dad," he said, "I don't feel alone anymore." Alaric put his arms around his son and held him the way he should have held him 14 months ago and did not let go for a long time. 3 weeks later, at a press conference that his publicist had not scheduled and his board had not approved, Alaric Vance stood before a room of journalists and said plainly that a corporate expansion decision made under his leadership had caused the closure of Hale Community Hospital, and that the resulting loss had contributed to the death of its founder, Dr. Thaddeus Hale. He did not use careful language. He did not deploy legal framing. He said that he had been wrong, that it had cost a family everything, and that he intended to rebuild the hospital, fully funded, or independently operated, and name it in Thaddeus Hale's honor. There were questions. He answered them. He did not perform remorse. He simply told the truth, which is the only form of apology that costs enough to mean something. Serafina watched the press conference from her phone in the mansion kitchen. When it ended, she set the phone down on the counter and stood very still for a moment. Then she pressed her hand flat against the surface, steadying herself. Markin said a quiet thank you to someone Alaric could not yet see as clearly as she could, though he was getting closer. He found her that evening in the sitting room. The same fireplace, the same chandelier light fracturing itself across the ceiling. The room where everything had begun. He did not make a speech. He was finished with speeches. He knelt. Not as a billionaire. Not as a man with resources and leverage and a legal team on retainer. As a man, imperfect. He rebuilt in places, still learning the language of humility but no longer afraid of it. I am not asking you to fix what's broken, he said. I'm not asking you to complete a transaction or fulfill a debt. I'm asking you to let me belong to something true. To you, to Elowen, to whatever this family already is. He paused. Marry me. Not so I can give you things. So we can build something neither of us could build alone. Serafina looked at him for a long moment. The way she had looked at him from the beginning, clearly, without the softening filter of wealth or reputation. What she saw now was different from what she had seen 11 months ago when she first walked through his door. She said yes. Quietly, completely. The wedding was small. No publicist, no investor list. A garden ceremony attended by people who actually knew them, which turned out to be fewer than Alaric expected and more than enough. Caspian stood beside his father for the entire ceremony, on his own feet. His color returned, his eyes clear, present in a way that made the officiant lose his place twice simply from the grace of it. Elowen stood beside her mother in a yellow dress she had chosen herself. She was not surprised by any of it. She had the expression of someone watching a story arrive at the ending they always knew was coming. Patient, and he's satisfied. Quietly radiant. When it was over and the small gathering moved inside, Elowen stood for a moment at the garden's edge, looking up at the late afternoon sky with the unhurried certainty of someone who had done what they came to do. The little girl hadn't made a bargain. She had spoken a prophecy,